Part 3. Active Imagination. Defining and approaching active imagination. In the pages ahead, we will be exploring the art of active imagination and learning for steps for working with it. Before we begin, there is a fundamental precaution that everyone must take. Before starting active imagination, be sure that there is someone available for you to go to call in case you become overwhelmed by the imagination and can't cut it off. For most people, this is not a problem. In fact, for most people, the difficulty is in getting the active imagination started. But some few people are subject to being so totally possessed by the flow of images once they start a particularly powerful segment of active imagination that they can't pull off out of it. Their minds get lost in the dream of fantasy and can't find a way back to the here and now of the ordinary world. Therefore, I advise people to start active imagination only after they have available to them either an analyst or a layperson who is familiar with the art and could talk them back down to earth if required. Once in a while, one will do active imagination in the morning, go to work or start the daily schedule, and then find the imagination returning, taking over the conscious mind, retrying to continue the story or dialogue where it left off earlier in the day. When this happens, it may be difficult to keep one's mind on the task at hand. In this case, it is best to call one's therapist or friend and get some help in pulling out of the involuntarily recurring active imagination. In the rare cases of people who get easily lost in the fantasy realm and can find their way back, it is better that they do not do active imagination, but find cooler ways of relating to their inner world. If you have any doubts about this, it would be advisable to consult with a Jungian analyst before undertaking this technique. This is not meant to discourage you from doing inner work, but the conscious is powerful. We are going to approach it, respect and care and are in order. With this attitude, we can derive the benefits of inner work while still protecting ourselves from the something overwhelming power of the unconscious. Distinguishing active imagination from passive fantasy. Active imagination is a special use of the power of imagination that Jung developed early in this century. Although many people have used it and its tremendous value is well proven, it is not widely known outside Jungian circles. Of those who have heard of it, many feel they do not understand it well enough to put it into practice. In this section, we will explore the basic concepts of active imagination, look at some examples, and learn a step-by-step approach that you can follow in doing your own active imagination. Essentially, active imagination is a dialogue that you enter into with the different parts of yourself that live in the unconscious. In some way, it is similar to dreaming, except that you are fully awake and conscious during the experience. This, in fact, is what gives this technique its distinctive quality. Instead of going into a dream, you go into your imagination while you are awake. You allow the images to rise up out of the unconscious, and they come to you on the level of imagination just as they would come to you in dream if you were asleep. In your imagination, you begin to talk to your images and interact with them. They answer back. You are startled to find out that they express radically different viewpoints from those of your conscious mind. They tell you things you never consciously knew and express thoughts that you never consciously thought. Most people do a fair amount of talking in their active imagination, exchanging points of view with their inner figures, trying to work out a middle ground between opposing views. even asking for advice from some very wise ones who live in the unconscious. But not all dialogue is verbal or spoken. Probably the earliest recorded experience of active imagination in its modern form was a visionary experience of Jung in which no words were spoken. Yet there was a profound interaction between his conscious mind and the images that appeared to him from the unconscious. This was one of the experiences that demonstrated to Jung that he could go into his fantasy or vision, participate consciously in it, and make it into an active exchange between the conscious and unconscious energy systems. Quote, I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears, and then I let myself drop. Suddenly, it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depth. I could not fend off a feeling of panic, but then abruptly, at not too great a depth, I landed my feet in a soft, sticky mass. I felt great relief, although I was apparently in complete darkness. After a while, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, which was rather like a deep twilight. Before me was the entrance to a dark cave in which stood a dwarf with a leathery skin, as if he were mummified. I squeezed past him through the narrow entrance and waded knee-deep through icy water to the other end of the cave, where on a projecting rock I saw a glowing red crystal. I grasped the stone, lifted it, and discovered a hollow underneath. At first I could make out nothing, but then I saw that there was running water. In it a corpse floated by, a youth with blonde hair and a wound in the head. He was followed by a gigantic black scarab, and then by a red newborn sun rising up out of the depth of the water. Jung, Memories, Dreams and Recollections, page 179. End quote. Through active imagination, it becomes more and more clear that the images that appear in imagination are in fact symbols, representing deep interior parts of ourselves. Like dream images, they symbolize the contents of our unconscious. Because these interior beings have minds of their own, they say and do things that are new to us, startling, often enlightening, sometimes offensive to our egos. Although Jung held dreams in high regard, he considered active imagination to be an even more effective path to the unconscious. The difference is this. In a dream, you receive signals from the unconscious, but the conscious mind does not participate. When you wake up, the conscious mind can remember the dream and think about its meaning, but during the dream itself, the conscious mind cannot actively participate. In active imagination, by contrast, the conscious mind is awake. It participates consciously in the events. In dreams, the events happen completely at the conscious level. In active imagination, the events take place on the imaginative level, which is neither conscious nor unconscious, but a meeting place. A common ground where both meet on equal terms and together create a life experience that combines the elements of both. The two levels of consciousness flow into each other in the field of imagination like two rivers that merge to form the powerful stream. They complement each other, they begin to work together, and as a result, your totality begins to form itself into a unity. The dialogue of conscious mind with unconscious gives rise to the transcendent function, the self, that stands as the synthesis of the two. It is a curious fact that dreaming decreases dramatically when one does active imagination. If you take this art seriously as a way of meditation, you actually assimilate the material of the unconscious before it needs to come up in dream form. The issues that would have been presented in dreams are confronted and worked out through active imagination. Because of this relationship between dreams and active imagination, Jung used to prescribe active imagination for people who were dreaming too much, who were overwhelmed by too many dreams every night and couldn't keep up with them by dream work. When you begin to do active imagination regularly, you will find that your dreams decrease in number, will become more focused and concentrated and less repetitious. As you deal with the issues in active imagination, your dream will have less need to repeat themselves. The essence of active imagination is your conscious participation in the imaginative experience. This kind of imagination is active because the ego actually goes into the inner world, walks and talks, confronts and argues, makes friends with or fights with the persons it finds there. You consciously take part in the drama in your imagination. You engage the other actors in conversation, exchange viewpoints, go through adventures together, and eventually learn something from each other. This quality makes active imagination different from ordinary passive fantasy. Passive fantasy is daydreaming. It is sitting and merely watching the stream of fantasy that goes on in the back of your mind as though you were at a movie. In passive fantasy, you do not consciously participate. You do not reflect on what is happening. And you do not take an independent, ethical position regarding what is going on. Passive fantasy also presents images from the unconscious. But since we can't consciously enter into it, it is mostly a waste of time and energy. The issues or problems that come up in the fantasy don't get resolved. Most such fantasies just repeat themselves over and over again on the edges of our minds until they exhaust themselves or exhaust us. There is no evolution because the ego never confronts the fantasy situation or enters into it as a conscious, independent force. A good example of this is the phenomenon of worry. Worry is one form of passive fantasy. Most of us have subjects that we worry about day in and day out. A fantasy runs through our minds in which we triumph and everything works out well. Then the counter-fantasy, the worry fantasy, rises in which we are defeated and humiliated. So long as we sit passively and let worry fantasies possess us, there is never a resolution, but in active imagination it is possible to go to the worry, actively confront it, enter into dialogue with it, find out who or what is in conflict within us, and do something about it. You will notice in all the examples of active imagination we look at that the story is always related in the first person. The I is always there. I go to a certain place. I see the image. I interact with it. The I has to be there, interacted with the other characters, or else the ego would not be participating. It is not active unless you are participating in the drama with your feelings and emotions. I have a feeling reaction. I am happy with what happens, interested, sad, or angry. The I must enter into the imaginative act and intensely, as it would if it were an external, physical experience. Although it is a symbolic experience, it is still a real experience involving real feelings. But your active participation, by your active participation, you convert what would have been an unconscious, passive fantasy into a highly conscious, powerful act of the imagination. When active imagination is done correctly, it pulls the different parts of you together that have been fragmented or in conflict. It wakens you powerfully to the voices inside you, and it brings about peace and cooperation between the warring ego and unconscious. The main purpose of this art is to provide communication between the ego and the part of the unconscious that we are usually cut off from. When you do active imagination, things change in the psyche. The relationship between the ego and the unconscious is altered. If there is a neurotic imbalance between the attitudes of ego and the values of the unconscious, the gap can be narrowed. The complementary opposites can be brought together. It sets one off on a path towards wholeness, toward an awareness of one's larger totality, simply because one has learned to enter into communication with the inner self. Active imagination example: talking with the inner artist. In order to make our discussion more concrete from the beginning, I will give you an example now of a session of active imagination recorded by a woman. This will be the first in a series of examples that we will look at in the next few chapters. These examples should give you a better idea of what ordinary people actually do in practice when they sit down to experience active imagination. How they approach it, how they write it out, and the different purposes that active imagination can serve in your own inner work. One point should come clear from these examples. You should not try to dress up your imagination and make it sound proper, grammatical, or refined. The object is to experience and record whatever flows out of your unconscious honestly in its raw, spontaneous form. You are not doing creative writing for other people's eyes. This is a private matter between you and your own unconscious, between you and God. So let it be as rough, crude, incoherent, embarrassing, beautiful, or unregenerate as it may be when it comes spontaneously out of your unconscious. The results will be more honest and more real. This particular sample of active imagination comes from a woman who found herself lying awake one night, unable to sleep because she had become obsessed during the repainting of her house. She had worked herself into a state of exhaustion, choosing colors, buying paint, doing the work, but she found herself unable to sleep because color combinations and different ways to combine colors, fabrics and furniture passed through her mind half the night in a fantasy she could not turn off. Since she had used active imagination before, she thought of going into her imagination to find an image that would represent the obsession. She wanted to find one within her who was obsessed and dialogue with that part of herself. This is an example of one of the finest uses of active imagination: to personify an unseen content of the unconscious and bring it to the surface in image form, so that you can dialogue with it and deal with it. We often have something vague and invisible in the unconscious that bothers us. We can feel the conflict just below the surface, but we can't see what is going on. We can associate it with anything specific or concrete. We feel the effect, but otherwise it is so vague and formless that we can't get a handle on it. Sometimes it is an inexplicable free-floating anger. We can't say why we are angry or at what, we just feel it. Moods, worries, depressions, inflations, and obsessions all come within this category. When this happens, you can go to the unconscious in your imagination and ask the unseen content to personify itself. You can start your active imagination by asking, where is the obsession? Who is obsessed? Where does this feeling come from? Who is the one inside me who feels this way? What is the image? What does he or she look like? If you do this, an image eventually comes into your mind. The image may personify the obsession itself, or it may represent the part of you that is generating the effect, the one who is obsessed, depressed, moody, or angry. Here, in this woman's experience as it flowed out of her in the middle of the night, she wrote some explanatory notes afterwards, which are enclosed in parentheses. Otherwise, it is what she wrote into her notebook that night as it came out of her imagination. Quote, while repainting the interior of our house, and exuberance for color and design, texture and balance arose. As the plans progressed, however, this interest took over my mind completely. I was unable to sleep, kept awake by an endless fantasy of palettes of colors and arrays of design. What had begun as an interesting project became an obsession. The process had taken on a life of its own and was harnessing all my resources. It functioned completely outside my conscious control. Although great energy was released, I was getting depleted. I was impatient and irritable toward my husband, who couldn't understand my great zeal. It wasn't enough to discipline myself, to label this great energy in me as negative animus, or attachment, although I felt this obsession as a negative force. I sensed that it was not so much negative as out of proportion. There was a new wellspring of vitality that had not been tapped. To control it by behavioral means would only repress this new resource back into the shadow. I would lose access to it. So I asked, what is it that's suddenly taken hold of me? In the middle of the night, I entered into a dialogue with that energy inside me to find out who it was and what it wanted. My active imagination. As I wrote it down in my notebook, E represents ego, my conscious mind speaking. GA represents the voice that was revealed after a while to be a Japanese artist. I could not see the figure who was speaking at first. E. What is happening here? I've been taken over by an unknown force. I can't sleep for the barrage of hues before my eyes. What are you doing? What do you want? Who are you? Voice. Sounds like a feminine voice in my imagination. The colors are so lovely. See the interplay. See how they evoke different aspects of nature. These, in particular, go so well in the wood tones of the bookshelves. E. Excuse me. Yes, it is indeed lovely, but I am very wary, and I have other considerations in life to worry about. I have other things to balance with this effort. You have taken over. At this point, I began to realize that the feminine voice inside me was not so much obsessed and thrilled as the colors. Voice. I have a clear idea of what wants to be created here. I am trying to find the right tools. We must find the right fabric and paint and design to make it happen, to make it physical. E. That is fine. But must you do it all night? GA. Oh, yes. I see what you mean. The figure grows clearer to me. This is a Japanese figure. At first it looked like a masculine figure, but now I see that it is neither masculine nor feminine, but androgynous. I feel that this is an artist, dressed in orange Zen Buddhist robes. The being stays silent as though wounded. I am suddenly tracking on this being personality that I know, that it has sensitivity, a vision derived from a meticulous appreciation of physical nature. I feel that I don't want to lose this being. I feel my irritation and frustration evaporating. I am getting very interested in this creature. E. Please don't retreat. I am not angry. We can come to an agreement that we both can thrive. Why are you pushing me so hard? GA. I'm afraid. E. Afraid of what? GA. I'm afraid that I will be locked up again. Locked up? There are rarely opportunities for me to express myself. It seems I must walk very fast and intensely while the door is open to me. Soon it will be over, and I will be locked up again. E. I begin to see what you mean. In my life, there have been very few outlets provided for you. So few that I hardly knew you existed. The culture I live in doesn't provide any place for you, and I have not stood separately from my culture in this manner to provide to you. J.A. That is true. I feel I have been starving. This may be my only opportunity. E. It doesn't have to be. If I provided other vehicles for you, other ways to express yourself, you would feel less desperate. Could you decrease your intensity? J.A. Yes. There is a long pause. Then the being speaks very gently. E. The being speaks very gently. Are you aware of what that implies? E. I feel apprehensive. I'm about to commit myself to something that perhaps I can back out of. I think so. I know it hasn't been easy for me to give permission to purely creative efforts in the physical and sensation world. I have always let particularly get in the way. I always feel the pressure of my work, my responsibilities. J.A. I have tried to express myself through you, but for the most part, those practical matters always win out. The pure joy of creating, living in the physical side of life, is a whole unto itself, without expectation of outcome or so-called practical benefits. E. This is true. And given my condition in my dominant attitudes, I know you had to make me uncomfortable to get my attention. I see that I will have to stand independent of the values of productivity that surround me and dominate me. I must deal with the negative masculine production mentality that carries these ideas and crowds out everything else. He uses my fear of failure, my performance anxieties, and I must confront my desire to produce, to be a success in my work that gets out of hand. I must sort through the values connected with art, artistic expression in the physical world. And I must make a place for you. More directly, I have to provide some immediate vehicles for you. What do you suggest? J. Something like ceramics, watercolors, plant flowers, arrange flowers, or we can do something less formal. I just want us to work and play with form and color and aspects of the physical world. E. Fine. I will need your help also. I need your awareness of the value of the sensation world to strengthen me against the prejudice that has ruled me. J.A. You only need to steel yourself and call to me, and I will respond. I will come back to you. There is an interesting footnote to this section of active imagination. The feeling reaction and the meanings that this woman drew from her experience. I resisted the language in which this active imagination was expressed. All these cliches about creativity and getting it into ceramics and into watercolors seemed trite. But I also understood that no matter how the language came out, and no matter whatever I felt, I was being fetish or silly. The physical and sensation side of me had to be nourished. I had to deal with the part of me on its own terms and do what it needed of me, within reason. The figure of the Japanese artist made me confront the degree to which my culture discourages an awareness of beauty. This culture is interested only in productivity and empiricism. It assigns no value to being as opposed to doing. It gives no value to beauty that exists in its own right without utilitarian production. The dialogue with this newly discovered lie led to a long investigation of the cultural prejudices. Prejudices I had absorbed by virtue of being born here. It helped me to sort out my individual nature from the collective. In other words, it was part of my individuation process. In the aftermath of this active imagination, this woman found a new world opening up to her. She talked to this inner Japanese artist figure regularly. She studied to a class in ceramics. She spends a certain amount of time every week working in her garden or at the ceramics workshop and in other physical or artistic activities that bring her a sense of beauty and put her in contact with earth connectedness, feminine values. As you know from her dialogue, she had been so tied up with mental work, thinking, analyzing, productivity that there was no room in her life for the physical side of life. The realm of physical beauty, the sense of being connected through the physical body to the earth, the plants, the colors and textures that intoxicate her in a Zen monk. So she had derived a deeper satisfaction from all this, a knowledge that she is nourishing a part of herself that was starving before, and her sense of who she is has been amplified accordingly. There is more to her than she had realized. Any quality within you can be personified in this way and persuaded to clothe itself in an image so they can interact with it. If you feel an inflation, you can go to your imagination and ask that inflation to personify itself through an image. If you vaguely feel a mood controlling you, you can do the same. It is the image that gives one a starting point. You can enter into a dialogue, you can interact, and you can move towards some kind of understanding. In this example, you find all the basic elements necessary for good active imagination. Please notice that the whole experience began in a kind of passive fantasy. As this woman lay in bed, colors and images of infinite possibilities floated before her eyes. At that point, she was merely a spectator, possessed by the fantasy. She converted this fantasy into active imagination precisely at the point where she stood outside the fantasy as a conscious ego mind, as an independent force in her own right, and then began to take an active role. She began to ask some questions and expect some answers. She looked for the one who was behind all this, who was generating this stream of fantasy. As a result, the image was consolidated and the conversation could begin. Another indication that this is real active imagination is that she was involved in her feelings, in what was going on. She was upset with the situation, but she was also concerned and moved when she found that there was a strong part of her inner self that had been ignored and repressed. She valued that part of herself, she appreciated it, she had feelings toward it. This is shown not only in what she said, but her doing something afterwards to honor that part of herself. Another important factor was her willingness to listen to the person from the unconscious. She did not try to dominate or override the inner voice. She was willing to let it have its say and to learn from it. There are many concepts relating to active imagination that we will explore in the chapters ahead. But already in this example you have the basic principles you will need in order to go genuine active imagination. If you hold them firmly in mind, you are already launched on the path towards understanding and using this high art. When you think you're making up something. A new patient came to do analysis with me. He was an intelligent man, but I could sense that he was also a rogue. You could feel it when he walked in front of his first session. There was a certain look in his eye. For the first few sessions, nothing happened. He could remember no dreams and there was no significant discussion. I wondered why he was interested in analysis at all. So I taught him about active imagination, thinking that this would be the way to unlock his unconscious and find out what was going on inside him. At first, nothing happened. No active imagination. I explained the 4 steps and said, Go do something in your imagination. Anything. Just record it in your journal. We will start from there. The next week he returned, and he had that gleam in his eye again. I knew he was up to something. He put down a couple of pages of active imagination. It was hair-raising material. It was pure melodrama, a combination of the perils of Pauline and 2 generations of Peyton plays all rolled into one. After that, week after week, he brought his pages of active imagination. The events got more intense, more desperate. It was huge battles of darkness against light, villains and victims, persecuted heroines, scandalous intrigues and betrayals. The poor girl was jumping from ice floor to ice floor with babe in arms, crossing the river with villain in hot pursuit. Week after week this went on, and I said very little. It was registering, but I watched to see where all this inner drama was leading, what was going to distill out of it. One day, he came in and dramatically threw down the last installment of the active imagination. There I read a terrible but also marvelous denouncement of the plot that had been developing all this time. When I finished reading, I said, "There, you bloody idiot. I've been pulling your leg the whole time. I've been making the whole thing up just to make a fool out of you. There wasn't a word of truth in it." I said nothing, but I thought, well, not the first time someone has made a fool of me. Then I just sat and waited. I looked at him, and I'll never forget the change that came over his face. The triumphant expression changed slowly to one of horror. Tears came to his eyes. He said, "Damn you, damn you, damn you, you tricked me. It was all true, and I didn't know it." Then he just fell apart. You see, even when he was trying to conjure up his fake story in order to fool me and ridicule the whole process, that fake story had to come out of his own insides, his own psychological guts, as it were. Well, he thought he was inventing something. He was spilling out the secret contents of his interior being. That horrible villain in the story was none other than the rock who gave him the sly gleam in his eye, who controlled him so much from hidden places. The same rock who believed that the whole point of analysis was to make an ass out of the analyst. The persecuted heroines were none other than his own inner feminine side. His inner life and feeling life were consigned to the ice flows. All the intrigues, innocent victims, tragedies, and adventures were an involuntary reflection of the horrible conflicts that raged within his own soul. He had tried to fake it, but accidentally in the process he did his active imagination. He experienced the symbols from the unconscious. Finally, his active imagination brought him face to face with inner self, who was never quite the same again. Whenever I start a patient on the active imagination, I get a series of questions. How do I know that I'm not just making all this stuff up? How can I talk with someone who is only a figment of my imagination? From my experience, I am convinced that it is nearly impossible to produce anything in imagination that is not an authentic representation of something in the unconscious. The whole function of the imagination is to draw up the material from the unconscious, clothe it in images, and transmit it to the conscious mind. Whatever comes up in the imagination must have been living somewhere in the fabric of the unconscious before it was given an image form by the imagination. Even if a person is frivolous and deliberately tries to fabricate something, to conjure up something silly and stupid, to imagine a pure fiction, The material that comes up through the imagination still represents some hidden part of that individual. It can be made up from thin air. It has to come from somewhere inside the person who is producing the images. The real question is not the authenticity of the images, but rather, what do I do with them? It is easy to misunderstand them and misuse them, but most people never get to the real question of what to do with the revelation from the unconscious, because they are so stuck in doubting its authenticity. Once, after a lecture, a man asked me, "But how do I know I am not just talking with my superego?" Sometimes you are talking with your superego, or that part of the psyche that can be called the superego. It quotes the law and tells you to conform to the ideas of right and wrong that your parents handed you, to the conventional ideas of your culture. Perhaps you, as an evolving ego consciousness, are answering back, saying that you have to question those things and think for yourself. The point is that you are talking with a part of yourself, and that is exactly the object of all this. Another patient said, "But I just feel as though I am talking to myself." My reply was, "Fine, you are talking to your various selves. That is the whole point. If you feel that you are talking to yourself, excellent. If you feel you are making it up, as my sly patient did, that's fine. Whatever you make up will come from your unconscious. It will be one of your interior personalities speaking. All that is required, ultimately, is that you write down what you are to say, what you have to say. Write down what the interior person have to say, and write down what you do together. When you begin to see your imagination for what it really is, you will realize that it reflects the inner world of your unconscious as faithfully as a highly polished mirror." Active imagination as mystic journey. The active imagination in the following example is quite different from what we have seen so far. Often when people begin a series of active imagination, what comes out has little to do with any immediate issue in their personal lives. As in this example, their experience seems more like a mythical adventure, a journey into the archetypal realm. It takes them off to the court of King Arthur, or to the glades of ancient Greece when the gods were walking in the plain view. Unless we understood that such adventures are symbolic experience of some great theme being played out in our unconscious, we would jump to the wrong conclusions. We would think this was merely entertainment, some fictional story that the writer has tossed off merely for enjoyment. As you will see, the following example sounds like the beginning of a great myth, a journey to a land where evil is a food, a heroic quest to help an innocent queen, a task of healing the sick and wounded. But the story is not fictional in the deepest sense, for every detail of it is absolutely true for the one who is passing through it in imagination. Sometimes great works of fiction to begin as active imagination, but at the moment that the story came out of the author's mind, it was not fiction, it was true representation of a dynamic deep in the unconscious, expressing itself symbolically through the imagination. If you find yourself meeting an inner guide and being led off of a mythical adventure, it will help you to understand that this is a legitimate and excellent way to live out parts of yourself that can be lived fully in your immediate daily physical life. Such mythical journeys also may be rites of passage. As we grow, as we move from one level of maturity to the next, there is always some great archetypal theme that must be confronted some conflict that must be resolved at deep levels where we are scarcely aware of them. Each of us has all the great archetypal themes hidden inside. We all have the seeds of the heroic quest within us. We must leave it out sometime, on some level. Each of us has the journey and labors of Psyche, the encounter with Eros and Aphrodite, built somewhere into our inner structure. One can't avoid these archetypal leitmotifs. One must express and experience them. Active imagination is one of the best and most legitimate levels on which to live these experiences. A few people are able to go off to the jungles of the Amazon, take part in a revolution, become war correspondents, or in some way live out the heroic quest on an external level. Most of us, however, have relationships, commitments, families, and all the normal practical limits that prevent us from extroverting this great primordial energy system within us. So what are we to do? The man in this example is a professional with an office and a busy daily schedule. He has a family and other people who depend on him. He wouldn't and shouldn't break all this up and go charging off to feudal lands looking for the innocent queen to defend. But within his soul he also has the life of a man of the Renaissance, a hero and a healer. He has the archetypal battle of light and darkness, of masculine power, drive and the feminine soul, of external practicality and the inner mystical vision. These great themes live in his unconscious, but they are greater than anything that is going on his local personal life. They express themselves in the magnitude of the mythical adventure that powers out of his imagination. This example represents only one session out of a long series of active imaginations that this man has done on this theme. Every day, or as often as he has time, he goes back to his active imagination, takes up where he left off, and continues the saga that is spinning itself out within him. This is often the case with active imagination. You will get an adventure going, or a profound conversation started with an inner character. And you will find yourself returning to the same place over and over to continue where you left off. In this way, the series may continue for days, weeks, or even months. Before we start, there are a few things that you should note. First, please observe this man's way of starting the active imagination. He goes to a bridge that is in place like Renaissance Europe. And there he finds the man with the feathered cap, the Renaissance man, who is teacher and guide. By going to an established place in your imagination and meeting up with such a guide, whom we often call psychopomps, because they guide us through the psyche, you can get your active imagination started directly and quickly each time. Second, please notice that this man has adopted a special ritual way of getting himself back and forth between the inner world of dreaming imagination and external world of human life. When he is ready to go to the inner world in active imagination, he puts on a blue monk's cowl in his imagination. This symbolizes for him his intention to enter into his inner world, into religious experience. When he is ready to leave the world of imagination and return to the daily human world, he gets up from his desk and puts on a plaid flannel shirt that his wife gave him. By putting on that shirt, he reaffirms his other commitment to his wife, to his family, to the earth-bound world of daily physical human life. Now, here is his session of active imagination, as he copied it out of his notebook. Greetings from the man with the feathered cap, the Renaissance man who is teacher and guide. He greets me at the bridge. He has his staff. I have brought my lantern and a backpack. Man, greetings. I brought you good tidings. The weather is good for our journey tonight. We must begin right away. However, for things can change quickly in this world. Let us begin while we have the energy. I am willing to begin this journey. I am willing to stick it through to its end. I begin in good faith that my actions will be sufficient to please the fates and they will be kind to me. Man. Let us begin then, and remember, even the smallest effort is of value. What matters is that we preserve. I am here to help you on this journey. Let us take the first steps together and set out way. Remember one thing. Worldly matters do not matter here. I live in the physical world. However, I am only a visitor here, and I do have outer responsibilities that may call me away. All I can do is say so. Then I must go. The ritual will be that I will put on my plaid flannel shirt my wife has given me, and then I will leave. I will put on my blue monk's robe to enter into your world. This will be the ritual. I will come here as often as I can, without injuring my outer relationships and responsibilities. Man. Agreed. This is good ritual. And it does not offend me, or the lady that I serve, who sent me to fetch you. Why has she sent you to fetch me? Man. She needs your help, your assistance. There is trouble in her land. This is a troubled time. Evil is afoot. She needs your assistance, as much as you can give her. I will do the best I can. Man. She appreciates this and loves you for it. I have been faithful to her for many years. How did you come to know her? Man. Through the service of my king, who replied recently. He was single when I first came to his service 25 years ago. He married the queen a year later. He had invited a neighboring lord to hunt on his land in thanks for some small favor the lord had paid him. When the lord came, he brought his daughter, 15 years younger than the king. He fell in love with her and courted her during their stay for 2 weeks. They married, and in my loyal service I have grown close to the queen. The king's health has failed the past 2 years before he died, and of course his enemies have tried to profit by this fact. His army and lords have been faithful and have held strong, but there is some subtle evil afoot, and the queen senses it. Why did she ask for my help? Man. Because a new star appeared in our eastern sky at night that is 4-pointed. I have never seen such a star before. The queen keeps a wise old man to counsel her on such matter. He advised our waiting on that spot on the horizon, where the star first appeared. It happens that that spot is this breach where you and I first met. We called you, and you appeared. We called you in our dreams. At this moment I have to pause in our long walk. I put on my plaid flannel shirt to attend to business in the outer world. Later I return. I put on my blue robe to enter the inner world again and find the man in the feathered hat. I am back. Man. Let us begin our journey again. So this is the story in brief of her whom I have come to know and serve, the queen, and of the evil that is about since my king's death. What kind of evil is it? Man. Abusive evil, evil that must be stopped. A small village was pillaged, the man murdered, put to the sword, male children killed, women raped and killed, little girls the same, babies left to die, in total 30 people murdered most cruelly. And the real mischief is that the murderers were dressed as king's men, and the rumor that goes through the villages is that the queen is a witch who wishes to dominate them and steal their possessions. But I know the queen. She is a good woman, and this is against her nature. She has a young daughter of her own, 18 years old. She is a tender woman. The queen has sent out a search partly for the villains, but no luck finding them as yet. I. Is that all? Man. No, there is an unlucky sickness about. 2 children have died, and no one has seen such a thing. A sweet smell on their mouth, but death. And there is a young girl in this village just ahead who is at death's door. It seems swollen, food and fever, wasting away. We come to the outskirts of a village. There is a thatched hut and fire burning inside. The man knocks and we enter. The mother is distraught and tired, tears in her eyes. The father is the same, toughened, well-feathered, people whose greatest possession is in this young daughter of theirs, perhaps 8 years old, blonde hair and features that would be beautiful if she were not so sick. She looks very pale, dark-hued under her eyes, and her breath is labored. She is feverish and racked with chills. She has been ill for 3 days, and her parents do not know the cause. Her left foot is swollen. The man introduces me as a healer who has come to offer help. Their eyes look pleading. We undress the little girl. I examine her and find all to be normal except for a small point of entry in the base of her left foot. There is a pus. I tell them to hold her down. The mother faints at the sight of my knife, but the father and my guide hold the girl down while I lance the foot. A cup of pus pours forth. I find them embedded in the flesh and an allowance made of flint and covered with black resinous substance. I keep this and wrap it up carefully. I give the girl a cool bath. I tell the family to boil water so we can clean the wound. We clean the wound. I then instruct them on cleaning bandages, boiling them, drying them in the sun, soaking her foot and giving her broth made from meat. I tell them I must leave and go back to my world, but I will return later. I tell them she will leave. I put on my plaid flannel shirt and leave in the inner world. This excerpt presents us with a completely different purpose for which active imagination can be used, in a different style. The purpose is, in this example, not to work with some immediate problem or conflict at the personal level. It is rather to make a place in one's life where the great archetypal themes can leave themselves out. This kind of active imagination connects us to the timeless cosmic dance of the archetypes that goes on eternally at the level of the unconscious. It is a way of discovering how those universal energy systems flow through us as individuals, how they particularize themselves and express themselves in a unique and special way within the container of our individual personalities. They seem distant and superpersonal. They seem to have nothing to do with our immediate personal lives. Yet they are the building blocks of our personalities and our life experiences. They are the elements that make us up. By going to active imagination, letting the archetypal themes take on symbolic form and participating in the drama, we transform the situation. The archetypal forces no longer play themselves out of stage, out of sight in the collective unconscious, but come up to the conscious level through imagination. We, in our ego forms, actually enter into the place of the archetypes and actually influence the outcome of the drama. In the deepest sense, this symbolic interaction with the archetypes puts us in the remarkable position of playing a role in the working out of fate. We cannot readily say where it is in this man's structure that the innocent queen is under attack by the forces of masculine power drive. We can't say where the sick little girl is who has been pierced by a poisoned arrow. It is not even particularly helpful to analyze these things, for the main point in active imagination is that one experiences it. Unlike dream work, where it is so important to analyze and draw meanings from the symbols, it can be counterproductive in active imagination if you distract yourself by thinking too much about what the symbols may mean in the psychological terms. The magic of active imagination comes about through the experience itself. Once the series of active imaginations has reached its resolution, it is permissible to draw meanings from it and to try to understand what the symbols add up to. But don't let analytical thinking get in the way of experience while it is happening. In all of us, the same archetypal queen and the same sick little girl struggle to survive, caught in a momentous battle of power that is waged ceaselessly, out of sight and out of time, in a borderland that lies along the frontier between personal psyche and collective unconscious. So long as we leave that battle out there, in a realm of twilight and at the edges of the universe, we can take no part in bringing this dynamic to a resolution. But by giving this cosmic clash of light and dark, feminine and masculine, queen and villain a symbolic form, by bringing it up to the surface, we can make it possible for the conscious ego to be aware of these huge player forces. It can participate in the cosmic drama, play its part and have its say in actually influence the long-range outcome. It becomes possible to consciously and voluntarily enter into the life of the archetypes that surround us, rather than sit helpless and mute, determined by powers that we can neither see nor understand. At first, this might seem rather esoteric or unrelated to real life. But you may be sure that this man's act of participation in the great archetypal epic, his healing of the sick child, his going with aid to the innocent queen, will make a difference in his life. Something specific and real is healed, deep inside, in response to a symbolic act of this quality. It will profoundly alter the long-range course of his life, the contours of his character. He will be acting eventually from a different center if he keeps up his active imagination, creating a different balance among the powers that make him up and invest him with energy. His attitude will alter. His choices will be changed. He will be different. The 4-step approach to active imagination. In the next few chapters, I will present a 4-step approach to active imagination that you can use to get yourself started. In this chapter, we will talk about the approach overall, and also about the things you need to do to set the stage for active imagination. For example, you need to know where you will work. You need to establish some privacy, and you need to decide how you are going to record your active imagination. Here are 4 steps. Invite the unconscious. Step number 1. 2. Dialogue and experience. 3. Add the ethical element of values. 4. Make it concrete with physical ritual. Dr. Maria Louise von Franz has shown that active imagination naturally falls into 4 basic stages. Different people will experience the stages in slightly different ways. I have tried with these 4 practical steps to formulate an orderly approach that will enable most people to find their way through the stages of active imagination without getting paralyzed or intimidated. Just as with dream work, it helps greatly to have a set of procedure, a series of steps you can follow in an orderly way that will get you past the obstacles, confusion, and indecision that sometimes prevent people from getting started or following through. Choosing a physical mode for recording your imagination. Before we launch into the 4 steps, it is vital that you get the physical details of your method worked out. You need to set the physical stage and decide how you're going to record your active imagination. These details are more important than you might think. Many people give up on active imagination before they get started, because they can't find a convenient way to record the imagination as it flows out. We have already talked about the importance of writing your inner work. This is even more true of active imagination. Your inner dialogue should be written or typed. This is your major protection against turning it into just another passive fantasy. The writing helps you to focus on what you are doing, and not wander off into random daydreams. It enables you to record what is said and done so that you will remember and digest the experience afterwards. Writing is not the only mode of recording your active imagination. Later, I will mention some other approaches. But for most people, writing is the easiest, most effective way. How to write. The two samples of active imagination I have given so far show a typical format for writing down the imagination. In the first sample, the woman used her notebook and wrote everything out by hand. She indicated who was speaking by an abbreviation in the margin. E stands for ego, meaning herself, and GA for Japanese artist, with whom she dialogued. I used the typewriter to record my own imagination. If you are proficient with the typewriter, it is very helpful. You can record your imagination rapidly, and you don't tire as quickly as you do if you write by hand. Nevertheless, many people prefer to write by hand, and this was the mode used by Jung. Some people feel that the use of a pen and ink feels more natural. They may even give their active imagination a ceremonial or archaic flavor by recording it with fine calligraphy. My own method has worked well for many people who at first had difficulty getting started. I use the lowercase setting on the typewriter to type what I am saying, and I use the shift lock, uppercase, L capitals, on typewriter to record what the other person in my imagination says back to me. In this way, I don't even have to indent a paragraph when there is a change of speaker. I shift on the typewriter when I change speakers, and I can move along as fast as my imagination flows. If the man whose mythic journey was the second example of active imagination had used my method, his active imagination would have looked like this. Follows an example of how to record with uppercase and lowercase. As you can see, the writer's words are in lowercase, and the words of the Renaissance man are in uppercase. If you use this method, you don't have to keep writing I or man in the margin to identify who is speaking, and you don't have to worry about identifying, paragraphing, or quotation marks. When you see the lowercase, you know it is you speaking. And when you see the uppercase, it is the other person talking. In this way, you can just power the dialogue and events onto the page as quickly as they happen and keep moving. There is no need to stop and make corrections. No one other than you will be reading it. If this format suits you, use it. If not, try the approach that was used in the earlier examples, or work a method out for yourself. The important thing is to have a simple, easy way to record what happens and what is said during the session of active imagination. If you have to struggle with quotation marks, sentence structure, punctuation, and spelling, you are already defeated before you start. It will feel too cumbersome and you won't continue. Adopt a method that is direct, simple, and works for you. Other ways of registering active imagination. A few people work through their active imagination in special modes. They may express their inner imagery through dance, by playing music, drawing, painting, sculpting, or speaking the dialogue out loud. Once I had a patient who was a dancer, and she could only express the events and dialogues in her imagination by dancing them. The first time she did that, It actually scared me speechless. She was acting out all the rawness, all the beauty, drama, struggle, and tragedy that went on in her inner life. All through her dance. She danced each character, acted out each role, portrayed animals, growled, grunted, shouted, fought, wept. By the time her session was over, I was crouched down, trying to hide into my chair. She said cheerfully, "Okay, Robert, you can come out now." After each session, she put into words for me what she had danced, what she had felt and seen in her imagination, and what it meant to her. This was helpful to me, since dance was for me a foreign language. Talking about it also helped me to make it more conscious. If you use one of these other modes, such as dancing or painting or playing it a sand tray, to act out the imagination or record it, it is still good to do some writing. Writing always helps to focus and make it conscious. For most people, writing is the best and most accessible form. The physical setting. Now that you have decided how you will record your imagination, you need to set up a room that is quiet and private enough that you can shut off the outside world for a while. You really cannot dialogue with your inner self if there are doorbells and telephones ringing every 5 minutes, children running through this room, dogs demanding to be fed or petted, and all of last month's unpaid bills sitting on the desk to distract you. You have to be assertive enough to set aside a room and block of time for yourself. Tell everyone in the house that you are not to be disturbed except for a nuclear blast or second coming. You are entitled to that kind of freedom, privacy and security. You need it in order to make your journey into the inner world. You also need to be alone. No matter how intimate you may be with another person, it is usually impossible to spill out everything that is hidden in your secret and conscious depth if you have someone else in the room who might wander over and look over your shoulder at what you are writing. If you feel like pacing the room, cursing, talking to some inner figure out loud, pounding on the wall, crying, you should be able to let your raw feelings and emotions without worrying that someone is watching and listening to you. There is also the temptation to start composing the active imagination so that it would sound nice and impressive for the other person if he or she happened to read it. It has to be clear that only you will ever read these pages. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to be honest in what you record. Now that you have set the stage, found a private place to work, locked the door, and decided how you are going to write or type your active imagination, you are ready to begin. Step 1. The invitation. In mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. C'è la diritta via era smarrita, e quanto a dir qual era e costa dura, questa selva selvaggia. In the midpoint of this journey that is our life, I found myself passing through the dark forest, the night path through which had disappeared, and what a hard thing it is to speak of that savage forest. Dante, Divine Comedy. The first step in active imagination is to invite the creatures of unconscious to come up to the surface and make contact with us. We invite the inner persons to start the dialogue. How do we make this invitation? We begin by taking our minds off the external world around us and focusing on the imagination. We direct our inner eye to a place inside us, then we wait to see who will show up. In the lines quoted above from Dante's Divine Comedy, we see how he set up the invitation. He went into his imagination and immediately found himself in a darkened forest. All the collective paths were eradicated. The right path through it had disappeared. He had to struggle through the tangled undergrowth and make his own path of discovery. There are a few great examples of active imagination in literature. The Divine Commedia is one of them. Wandering in the dark forest, Dante falls through a hole in the ground and finds himself in the inner world. He is at the threshold of Hades. He meets the poet Virgil, who, as he discovers, was sent to him by the beautiful Beatrice. Virgil guides him and talks with him as they hike through the various levels of hell. This is a classic example of how to begin active imagination. Go to a place, describe it vividly and in detail so as to get yourself anchored there, and then see whom you encounter. In Dante's case, once he connected with Virgil and began walking, he met various people. Some of them were historical figures, some were people he had been personally acquainted with before they died. With each one he had an exchange of ideas or a clash of values. At a certain point, Virgil bows out and says that one greater than he will be Dante's guide for the rest of his journey. Then appears Beatrice, one of the great symbols of anima in all Western literature, who leads Dante to purgatory and paradise. The Commedia is true active imagination. Dante tells his story in first person. His ego lives through the entire experience, reacting, taking part in the events, dialoguing with the inner persons that he finds in his imagination. It is a spontaneous outpouring of Dante's own unconscious, mediated to us through his imagination. He deals with the great archetypal themes of loyalty and treason, virtue and evil, heaven and hell, life and death, that spring from collective unconscious. They are common to all of us, but this was his first version of the archetypal themes, his own experience of the universal leitmotifs, his own individual way of living now the evolution that each of us must make. You don't need to write a great work of literature. In fact, if you studied writing for other people's eyes, it would probably distract you from living out your inner adventure honestly. But you do need to write your own episode, your own chapter in the universal Divina Commedia that is our common human life. In order to do this, you can't copy Dante's version or someone else's. You must record what spontaneously flows through you from your own special corner of the collective unconscious. For many people, this first step, the invitation, is a little difficult at first. They sit down at the typewriter or with pen in hand and find that their minds have gone blank. If this happens, it may be that all you need is to have patience. Just wait. Keep your mind focused on your imagination, and images will usually appear before long. If not, then you need to use one of the specific techniques that follow. Sometimes it is hard to get something going. You may slam so many doors in the faces of our interior persons that when we finally get around to opening the door, they don't come running out to greet us. If they do, they are likely to be angry and say, "Look, you have ignored me and slammed the door in my face so many times that now I have your attention. Now that I have your attention, I have a few things to say to you. But once you have invited, you have to take what comes." To invite doesn't mean to manage. Everyone who begins this art has a lot of preconceived ideas about who ought to be there and what these inner characters ought to say. People expect to hear immediately noble speeches by a great mother or profound wisdom from an inner guru. These things often happen, but just as often we find ourselves looking at the depression we have refused to face, the sense of loneliness, emptiness, or inferiority we've always run from. If this is what happens when you make your invitation, accept it. This negative material is the other side of your total reality. An hour later, you must dialogue with it. Jung said that it is exactly where you feel most frightened and most in pain that your greatest opportunity lies for personal growth. With these basic principles in mind, we can look now at some specific approaches you can use for making your invitation. Waiting on alert. Perhaps the purest form of active imagination is that in which you simply clear your mind, go to your imagination and wait to see who will appear. This is the approach that von Franz calls emptying the ego mind. We clear the mind of all thoughts of the external world and simply wait, with an alert and attentive attitude, to see who or what will appear. Sometimes this approach may require great patience and concentration. Nothing may appear for some time. What does come up may seem insignificant or unworthy to your ego mind, causing you to reject it out of hand. If you focus your mind long enough, you will usually find that some image is waiting in the wings, ready to come on stage and present itself to your attention. When this figure does appear, you should not stand in judgment. Give in to your prejudices or reject it. It is best to assume that it has something to say that is relevant. A figure from your dream from last night may rise up, and you may find that this image wants to continue where it left off in the dream. Or an image may appear that you have never seen before. You may wonder who this is and why he or she has appeared in my imagination. So the simplest invitation is the most obvious. Who are you? What do you want? What do you have to say? Your dialogue begins. I have said that this is probably the purest form of active imagination, because the ego does not choose whom you will dialogue with or what will rise up into the imagination. You present an attitude of complete receptiveness or whatever appears, with no preconditions or expectations attached. How to start? Many people are not suited to the method of pure receptiveness or clearing the ego mind. They find it very difficult to get their imagination launched by merely focusing the mind and waiting. They may just draw a complete blank for long periods of time. I believe that in these cases it is correct to prime the pump. That is, to do something specific and deliberate to get the flow of imagination going. We will now look at several legitimate ways that you can do this. One precaution must be observed. Once you have found the image and studied the inner dialogue, you must relinquish control. Once the invitation is made and the image appears, you can't dictate the focus of your imagination, and you can't push it in any particular direction. First, using your fantasies. Harnessing fantasy is a way of converting passive fantasy into active imagination. In its simplest form, you look at the fantasies that have been going through your mind today, and you choose an image, an inner person, or a situation. Then you go to a place and that person and use it as the starting place for active imagination. Participate in the fantasy. Enter into dialogue with the characters. Record what is done and said, and thereby convert this passive fantasy into genuine active imagination. This approach to active imagination is especially helpful when a person has too much fantasy material. The active imagination will reduce the quantity and intensity of the fantasy by relieving the pressure from below. When you have a recurring fantasy that stays in your mind all day, it indicates that there is some inner problem that needs to be worked through. When a huge number of fantasies flood your mind, it often means that you haven't been given enough attention to the unconscious. It compensates your imbalance toward the outer world by flooding you with fantasy, which forces you into a kind of involuntary inner life. In these situations, Jung said, you can take the subject of your fantasy and start a conscious dialogue with its images. Instead of passively watching the same fantasy repeat itself over and over in your mind, you carry the material forward in active imagination. You establish a dialogue among the different parts of yourself that are concerned and bring the conflict to a resolution. You convert the fantasy into consciousness. Remember that fantasies are excellent divining rods. If a fantasy is running through the back of your mind today, you can safely assume that it is expressing in symbolic form one of the main dynamics, conflicts, or areas where psychic energy is concentrated in you. If you go to that fantasy and take it as starting point for active imagination, you will be automatically focused on an inner subject that is immediate, relevant, and important. So there are two important things you can accomplish by learning to harness passive fantasy and turn it into active imagination. First, it will help you to make your invitation when you have gone dry. When no images come up, your mind is blank and you can't seem to get your imagination started. Second, when you find that you have a stream of fantasies that overwhelm you, it is an excellent way to focus on a fantasy, bring it up to the surface, and live it out, consciously through active imagination. Instead of letting the stream of fantasy repeat itself wastefully or trying to act it out externally, you make it conscious on the level where it belongs, the level of imagination. Second, visiting symbolic places. One very simple way of making your invitation to go to a place in your imagination and start exploring to see whom you meet there. Usually when you do this, your imagination will take you to the inner place where you need to go and connect you to the inner persons that you need to meet. Many people fall into the habit, without realizing it, of returning to a special place in their imagination. Remember the man who goes off on an adventure with a Renaissance cavalier? Notice that he has the custom of always returning to the same bridge in his imagination. At that bridge, the Renaissance man always comes to take him off into the inner world. For me, the seashore is a magical place that often appears in my dreams. When I don't know how to start my active imagination, I frequently go to the seashore in my mind and start walking. Inevitably, something happens or someone appears, and the imagination is launched. There have been a few days when I walked and almost nothing happened. Sometimes you can grow weary walking. But generally, if you go to the inner place and search, you will find someone waiting for you. I had a patient years ago who had a terrible time getting started in his active imagination. Nothing ever seemed to happen to him in his external life, and the same dull quality carried over into his imagination. He was an absolute blank. So I told him to go to the beach, as I do, and start walking, and look around and see who he would meet. The next week he returned and said, "Yes, I walked on the beach, but no one wanted to talk to me, nothing happened." So I got mildly upset. Look, Something has to happen. You walk on the beach long enough and you see your feet will get blisters. You'll have to go to the hospital. You'll fall in love with the nurse and get married. Something will happen. Now go do it. The following week, he returned, looked at me with his absolutely serious, deadpan expression and said, "The nurse wasn't any good, so I didn't marry her. But at least he got started. You're in a place, maybe a groove in the jungle and an Arcadian meadow with Pan lurking in the shadows, or a monastery cell. You can find the place within you where the energy is, and you can learn how to find your way back to it. Going to your inner place becomes your way of inviting the inner world." Third, using personifications. Let us go back in our minds to the woman who was obsessed with painting her house. You may remember that she made her invitation by personifying the obsessive feelings. She looked for an image that would represent the one inside who was possessed. She started by talking to the one who seemed obsessed. At first, it was like talking to the air around her. Then she heard a voice in her imagination that in turn became an image that she could see. E. What is happening here? I've been taken over an unknown force. I can sleep for the barrage of hues before my eyes. What are you doing? What do you want? Who are you? Voice. Sounds like a feminine voice in my imagination. The colors are so lovely. See the interplay. See how they evoke different aspects of nature. These in particular go so well with the wood tones of the bookshelves. E, excuse me, and so on. This provides you with another way of priming the pump. If you have some aspect that is following you around and dogging your steps, some mood that you can't shake off, this gives you a strong hint as to where you should go to start your dialogue with the unconscious. Go to the one inside you who is obsessed, depressed, or in some other mood. Go into your imagination and say, "Why is the one inside me who is depressed today? Where are you? What do you look like? Please take some form I can see and come up and talk with me. I want to know who you are and what you want." Fourth, dialoguing with dream figures. One of the earliest uses that Jung found for active imagination was as a means of extending dreams. If a dream is not resolved, or you keep getting the same dream over and over again, you can extend the dream out through imagination and bring it to a resolution. This is a legitimate use of imagination, since the dream and the imagination come from the same source in the unconscious. This, in turn, provides another way to make an invitation. One goes back to the dream in imagination and enters into a dialogue with the characters there. One can pick out a specific person in the dream that one feels the need to talk with. One can speak specifically with a single dream figure, or return to the situation in the dream and take up the whole encounter where the dream left off. You can effectively continue the dream and interact with it by extending it into your active imagination. In this form, active imagination becomes a valuable addition to your dream work. It allows you to go to a dream where you have been left hanging, where the situation has not been resolved, to develop the inner situation that the dream presented. It allows you to continue the story, to go through the next step the dream is leading toward, and bring the whole issue to resolution. So when you find yourself wanting to do active imagination but can't seem to get started to find a starting point, go to a recent dream. Not only will it help you to get the active imagination flowing, it will transform your relationship to your dream and your relationship to the inner person, because you will be adding to your conscious participation to the dream. Active imagination illustrations. Before we move on to the second step, I will give you 3 examples of experiences in either extending a dream with active imagination or using a dream person for dialoguing. Our first example comes from Yoon. This was one of the earliest uses that he made of active imagination. Yoon discovered the seeds of some of his most profound and far-reaching insights into the nature of the psyche by going to an inner person, whom he called Philemon, and who first appeared in a dream, and doing active imagination with him. Quote, "Soon after this fantasy, another figure rose out of the unconscious. He developed out of the Elia figure. I called him Philemon. Philemon was a pagan and brought with him an Egypto-Hellenistic atmosphere with a Gnostic coloration. His figure first appeared to me in the following dream. There was a blue sky like the sea, covered not by clouds but by flat brown clouds of earth. It looked as if the clouds were breaking apart and the blue water of the sea were becoming visible between them. But the water was the blue sky. Suddenly there appeared from the right a winged being sailing across the sky. I saw that it was an old man with the horns of a bull. He held a bunch of 4 keys, one of which he clutched as if he were about to open a lock. He had the wings of the kingfisher with its characteristic colors. Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies I held conversations with him, and he said things which I do not consciously thought. For I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. He said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself, but in his view, thoughts were like animals in the forest. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Through him, the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. He was a mysterious figure to me. At times he seemed to me quite real, as if he were a living personality. I went walking up and down by the garden with him, and to me he was what the Indians call a guru. Memories, Dreams and Recollections, pages 182-83. End quote. There is a seemingly endless variety of relationships that can be established with dreams persons if you will go to them in active imagination. And you can confirm in your own experience that you begin to change inwardly in response to the dialogues and experiences that you pass through with these inner persons. If there is a terrible conflict with a dream figure during a dream, you can spend many sessions of active imagination with that person, working out the conflict and reaching an understanding. If, like Yoon, you discover a wise, prophetic old man or woman in your dream, you can go back to that dream person regularly to ask for wisdom and counsel. A long time ago, I dreamed that I was sitting in my study, behaving myself and doing whatever one does in one's study. Suddenly, a lion walked in. It terrified me. I tried everything I could to get the lion out of the study. I pushed, I ordered, I demanded, I made a big noise that frightened me more than the lion. I twisted his tail. But there, the dream ended. I was still terrified, and the lion wouldn't leave. As you can see, this is a completely unsatisfactory conclusion for a dream. There was no resolution of the problem. So I took the dream into active imagination. In my imagination, I started up exactly where the dream had left off. I immediately got frightened all over again. The hair went up on the back of my neck, and chills went down my spine, all of which means that it was high-quality active imagination. I was there in my feelings. It felt to me as though I had physical lion in my physical study, and my head might be bitten off. My heart pounded. I shook and I broke out in a cold sweat. I did 4 different sessions of active imagination on that dream before it dawned on me that the lion wasn't hurting me. One is so stupid with one's own interior things. Anyone else would have said within 30 seconds, "Look, the lion isn't hurting you. Why twist his tail? Maybe he has something to say. Maybe he is an important part of you that you need to accept." But it took 4 sessions of imagination dedicated to trying to get rid of the creature before it dawned on me that he probably belonged with me, and I needed to integrate him into my life. The imagination was so strong that I couldn't cut it off. Every time I went into my study to work, the imagination would start up again. And there would be the spirit lion prowling around the study. Every time I tried to do some work at my desk, he would come over and lick me, start sniffing at the typewriter, or growl out the window and distract me. I started talking with him. "Who are you? What are you here for? Look, what you're doing in my study? I can't get any work done here with you breathing down my neck. Anyway, you scare the hell out of me, even if you are a dream lion. Why don't you go outside and find some other lions or something? Lions don't belong in the house, and they don't belong in my civilized, respectable daily routine." I got used to him, but it took many weeks for me to come to some kind of accord with that interior content in myself that choose to portray itself as a lion. It is a very powerful, even frightening part of myself, so the more clearly I saw who that part of me it was, the more scared I became at the implications. It took a lot of work to be able to face it. Finally, after many sessions of active imagination, one day the lion went over to a particular place in my study, sat down on his back haunches, and became a bronze sculpture. In his right paw, which he held out, was a book, and I read the most amazing things in that book. He has stayed there ever since. Occasionally I go in imagination back to that place in the interior study to see if he is still there. He is. And the book is still there, always opened to a page with important information. Our final example in this chapter is the experience of a young woman who had a short dream about her husband and her brother. Since the dream left her hanging, so to speak, she decided to go to the persons in the dream in active imagination and see if she could get the issues ironed out. With this example, we have the advantage of a transcript of the actual word-for-word dialogue that she did in her imagination. You will recognize this dream. It is the first dream we looked at in this book. We have already seen how the dreamer drew meanings from it through dream work. Now we also see how she used her dream to launch active imagination. Dream. I am looking for my car keys. I realize my husband has them. Then I realize that my brother has borrowed my car and has not returned it. I see both of them and I call to them. They do not seem to hear me. Then a disheveled young man like a renegade gets into my car and drives off. I feel extremely frustrated, helpless, abandoned, upset. Note from the dreamer. I decided to do an active imagination because there was no resolution to the problem in the dream. and I always feel that that is a clear invitation from the unconscious to work with imagination. I felt the dream showed I was in a bad relationship to my inner masculine side. I had no communication. My collective way, the car, was being taken away, but there was no solution to the problem. I set up dialogue with the three men in my dream, but I changed the images so they wouldn't look exactly like my physical brother and husband, so that the imagination would not work magic on the external husband and brother. I dialogued with the archetypal generic husband and brother. Why are you doing this to me? To H and B. You've both broken promises. H and B. Both silent. They won't talk. The renegade turns his back on me and faces away. Please, why won't you talk to me? Please speak. Why did you take my car away in a dream? Why did you leave me alone? What is going on? H and B. They look at each other. I see the husband has the keys in his hand. You are ignoring me, yet you've clearly done something to get my attention. What do you want? Long silence. Please don't ignore me, it hurts. I need to talk with you. H. You have been ignoring us. Besides, you don't need keys. I can drive without them. B. You don't need a car. I don't understand. H. Tosses keys to B and says, if you are going to act like Superwoman all the time, why don't you fly where you need to go? Now I feel wounded. I begin to understand his meaning. I have been far too busy, trying to do too much, inflated. I feel how sad, empty is more apt. Empty I am beneath all this striving. H. You act as if you don't need us, as if you don't need anything. That's why we have been so distant. I can see now I've been alienated from both of you. No wonder I've become so strained lately. I'm sorry. I let myself go overwhelmed by work, and I went completely unconscious. Now I have a sense of who the renegade is. He turns to face me, speaking to renegade. You are the runaway energy in me. You say yes to tasks that seem reasonable, productive, worthwhile. And by an arbitrary standard, they may be so, but they are not what I want. I see now. You are the one who gets in the car and just drives off with me. You set up all this forward motion. But it isn't what I want, and it isn't what is right for me. As I look at all I am doing, I see that the writing project can wait. And I no longer want to teach the continuation class. The other classes are fine, but one less will make my life my own again. R. The writing project is a good one. It could be significant to other people. Besides, you have already said you were interested. I made no commitments. You make it seem as if waiting would be catastrophic. It isn't so. R. Well, a meeting the class will disappoint the students. They specifically requested it in order to help with the field placements. You will lose credibility if you back out. Many people depend on me, but I am not indispensable. Someone else can teach it. The students will learn from having another point of view. I'm feeling increasingly more balanced, more myself. I don't like the anxiety of refusing these requests, yet there are obviously more demands that can be met. I dislike even more the feeling of too muchness, of doing things unconsciously, of feeling disconnected and automatic. Look, I like my work, but when I allow you to dictate to me, I feel less and less joy in what I do. I forgot to notice the difference between what is practical and what holds meaning. I am not backing out. I am waking up. I am choosing. I hear a group of starlings in the acacia tree outside my window. Their voices are distinct and fresh. I hadn't noticed them before. How could I have missed it? I fall into quietness and thank the starlings for calling me to attention. After some time I know that the three figures before me have been transformed. There is one man, a beloved figure from former dreams. We are tuned in the silence and remain so for some time. This example shows us how a short and resolved dream situation can be transformed by extending into active imagination. How quickly and directly she found the main application of the dream. By going to the three dream figures and asking them to talk with her, she effectively started the dream all over again, at the point where it had left off. But the dream took on a new element at that point because she added her conscious participation to it. Instead of merely watching the dream, she entered into it and began to play a conscious role in it. Even with the advantage of knowing with whom she wanted to speak, she still had some difficulty with the invitation. At first, these dream characters didn't want to speak. But by persistently keeping after them and letting them know that she was ready to talk and to listen, she pulled them out of their resentment and got the dialogue going. From this example, please find encouragement to go to your own dreams and use them as starting points for making your invitation to the unconscious. Use this method as a way of continuing your own dream until you make the evolution and gain the consciousness that is yours. Step 2. The dialogue. You have invited the unconscious. The images have risen up into your imagination. Now you are ready to begin the dialogue. Making a dialogue is mostly a matter of giving yourself over to the imagination and letting it flow. There are various principles we can follow, but moving the experience ahead consists more than anything else in letting the inner figures have a life of their own. A particular matter you say or do whatever comes in your mind that feels appropriate and ethical. If a figure appears in the imagination and seems to have nothing to say at first, one may get the conversation going by asking who he or she is. Ask what the person wants, what the person would like to talk about, would like to do. It is better to ask questions than to lecture or start making pronouncements, because the basic attitude you want to show is a willingness to listen. If an inner figure does something, write it down. Then do or say whatever your reaction is in response. Often, an inner person will try to draw you into some activity, take you somewhere, lead you off on a path or a journey. If it seems right to you, then do it and record what happened along the way. If you feel that it is wrong to follow the person, or you don't like the activity or involvement that the inner person suggests, you have the right to say no. You have the right to refuse and to state your reasons. That in turn will often lead to a heated discussion of the conflict between this inner person and what you think you want, or don't want, or don't approve of, or are afraid of. All this is excellent material for the active imagination. The dialogue has begun and the different parts of the self are learning from each other. If you find that an inner character won't speak, it is legitimate to prime the pump. You can initiate an exchange just as you might if you were stuck with a guest who was shy and uncommunicative. Ask questions, express your feelings. If you are afraid of the person who has come up, say so. If the person reminds you of an experience you had, or dream, or someone in the outer world that you know, tell the person about it. Step 2. The dialogue. You have invited the unconscious. The images have risen up into your imagination. Now you are ready to begin the dialogue. Making a dialogue is mostly a matter of giving yourself over to the imagination and letting it flow. There are various principles we can follow, but moving the experience ahead consists more than anything else in letting the inner figures have a life of their own. A particular matter you say or do whatever comes in your mind that feels appropriate and ethical. If a figure appears in the imagination and seems to have nothing to say at first, one may get the conversation going by asking who he or she is. Ask what the person wants, what the person would like to talk about, would like to do. It is better to ask questions than to lecture or start making pronouncements, because the basic attitude you want to show is a willingness to listen. If an inner figure does something, write it down. Then do or say whatever your reaction is in response. Often, an inner person will try to draw you into some activity, take you somewhere, lead you off on a path or a journey. If it seems right to you, then do it and record what happened along the way. If you feel that it is wrong to follow the person, or you don't like the activity or involvement that the inner person suggests, you have the right to say no. You have the right to refuse and to state your reasons. That in turn will often lead to a heated discussion of the conflict between this inner person and what you think you want, or don't want, or don't approve of, or are afraid of. All this is excellent material for the active imagination. The dialogue has begun and the different parts of the self are learning from each other. If you find that an inner character won't speak, it is legitimate to prime the pump. You can initiate an exchange just as you might if you were stuck with a guest who was shy and uncommunicative. Ask questions, express your feelings. If you are afraid of the person who has come up, say so. If the person reminds you of an experience you had, or dream, or someone in the outer world that you know, tell the person about it. Probably nothing gets the dialogue going as quickly or on as deep a level as does an expression of feelings. When you let your feelings out and invite your inner person to do the same, it usually constellates the exchange very directly. This is because feelings are mostly concerned with values, who or what we love and appreciate, what we are afraid of, what we feel is dishonest or illegitimate, what we desire for ourselves or others. And values, we find, are mainsprings of our human lives. It is extremely important to write down everything as it happens and everything that is said. Writing protects you from wandering off into passive fantasies that creep in from the edges of the mind. It helps you to concentrate more and experience more deeply. The physical writing etches the experience more vividly in the conscious mind. Conversing with one image. In order to do a true act of imagination, it is necessary to stick with the image that we start with. Stay with the situation until there is some kind of resolution. Once one has encountered a particular image or started dialogue with it, it is important to continue from there and not allow oneself to be distracted by other images or fantasy material that may jump into the mind and compete with active imagination. If you allow your mind to fleet roam from image to image and situation to situation, you will only put yourself through a meaningless series of starts and stops, none of which will lead anywhere. If your ego is genuinely going to the inner figures and interacting with them, then there will be a continuous, coherent experience with the original figures. Don't sit passively while your mind fleets from one image to another, from one film clip to another. Active imagination is a complete experience, one that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Like a dream, it usually produces a statement of a problem, a period of interaction with the problem, and the different viewpoints on the subject, and finally, a resolution of the conflict or the issue. This may take place in one session, or it may require a series of sessions that continue for days or even years. You can get a perspective on this by remembering the examples we have already given. The first was the dialogue between a woman and her inner Japanese artist. In that dialogue, one can easily identify the point where the problem was raised, right at the beginning. There followed a long conversation in which the alternatives were spelled out that might be solutions to the problem. Finally, at the end of the dialogue, there was a resolution. This was not the last conversation with the Japanese artist, but already within this one session, we find a resolution of a basic issue. By contrast, consider the example of the man who was led off on his mythical journey to help the queen who was in distress. In this session of active imagination, the problem has been stated. There are evil forces at work in the land, people being hurt. All this is being blamed on the innocent queen. As the man sets off on his journey with his guide, he does what he can to begin to heal the land by healing the little girl. But his adventure has only begun. There is more work to do. In fact, this particular active imagination has gone on for years and still continues. Participating with your feelings. Full participation in the essence of active imagination. All the things we have said about the distinction between active imagination and passive fantasy are particularly important at this stage. It is vital to join in as a complete partner in the exchange. One may make suggestions, initiate, ask questions, argue, object, everything one would do in any exchange between equals. The most important aspect of this is to be present in your feelings and participate with your feelings. One must sense that it is real, that it is actually happening, even though it is inside rather than outside. If you are detached from it, or just feel that it is nothing but a fantasy, you are watching from a safe distance, there is no real experience. If one is not really participating with the feeling side, it is not true active imagination. A good example of being present in your feelings is the woman in the example who dreamed that two male figures, who resembled her husband and her brother, were ignoring her. What kind of feelings did she have when she went to them in active imagination? She was furious, she was hurt, she was indignant. And she actually felt all that. Her feelings and her emotions were there in the exchange with these two inner persons, and it was her feelings, finally, that they responded to. One can actually tell whether a person is doing real active imagination by the feeling responses that come out. If the normal human reaction to the situation in the imagination would be anger, fear, or intense joy, but none of these feelings are present, then I know the person is detached from the proceedings, just watching from a distance, not really participating, not taking it seriously. We must participate completely. There is, however, one line that should not be crossed. We must not stray from the zone of participation into the zone of control. In active imagination, we cannot exert control over the inner persons or over what is happening. We have to let the imagination flow where it will. Let the experience develop, without trying to determine in advance what is going to happen, what is going to be said, what is going to be done. Sometimes it is hard to see the difference between fully participating and trying to control. You can draw a good analogy from your dialogues with external people. When you are in a conversation with someone, courtesy and respect lead you to give the other person equal time. We try not to dominate the conversation. We don't flood the other person with a stream of opinions so as to cut off his or her chance to express a viewpoint. The same rules of courtesy, restraint, and respect apply when we dialogue with the citizens of the inner world. Sometimes what your inner person is saying sounds stupid, primitive, or nonsensical, or it rubs you so completely against the grain that you get angry. Still, you must let it be said. Try dropping control for once. Stop trying to make the inner figures sound intelligent or sensible according to your ego's standards, and let them be whoever or whatever they are. To give up control means to relinquish your preconceptions about what should happen, what should be said, what message or meaning ought to come out of all this. In fact, you should not be thinking about what it means at all at this stage, because that would lead you into trying to stage manage the experience to come out with the right messages. We need to forbear imposing the ego's expectations on the proceedings. We need to give up the ought to mentality and instead let flow what is, the feelings, conflicts, and personalities that truly live in us below the surface.